Good evening, gentlemen, and happy Monday. Welcome back, and I hope you had a wonderful and restful weekend. When we last spoke on Friday, we were talking about ordered versus disordered loves and how it is that we can tell the difference. What constitutes this is an ordered love, this is a disordered love. And one of the things that we began to say, first of all, was that an ordered love, much like ordered goodness, ordered desires for goodness, is that an ordered love seeks and embraces everything that it properly should be as we say, this is good, I will this, and I love this. Whereas a disordered love gives us a too narrow view of existence. But to really get a sense of that, what we have to do is go back to the very beginning and look what is the order of creation itself. And so then how should we be looking at creation? Going back to that time before sin, that time of human innocence. As we do so, we're going to be using the help of a work by St. John Paul II, Man and Woman He Created Them, a theology of the body. Normally, because of how it was originally published, the title it was originally published under, it's often known simply as Theology of the Body or John Paul II's Theology of the Body. But this is the full title. And unfortunately, it's very often just reduced to a book about sexual ethics. It does certainly have much to say about human sexuality and what it means to be creatures that express love, among other things, in sexual ways. But theology of the body really is that. It is having a theological look. In light of Revelation, what can we say about human existence and human existence in bodies? Bodies are an essential part of who we are, and we need to embrace that and not simply say, oh, spiritual is good and material is evil. John Paul II definitely wants to reject that notion. And what he does to do this is he gives us a three-part image. He gives us a triptych. The story of creation, the Beatitudes, and then the resurrection of Christ. And using these three panels of art, he says, let's see what it means to be human. Let's see what it means to be a truly embodied creature created and loved by God. So with the help of St. John Paul II, with the help of Jesus, let's now go back and see, in the very beginning, what did it mean to be brought into existence by God as embodied creatures, and what bearing does this have on our love and our life, marriage, and all of these wonderful things that go into being human? John Paul II takes his cue from Jesus himself, and in particular, a dispute that Jesus was having with the Pharisees in the Gospel of Matthew. The Pharisees are trying to challenge Jesus on a point of Mosaic law. Jesus keeps on saying that marriage is a good thing and that we should really try and push away from divorce, and saying, you have heard it said, but I say to you. The Pharisees are annoyed to no end at hearing Jesus saying, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye, but I say to you this. You have heard it said, you shall not kill, but I say to you, if you even think of your brother in an angry way, you shall be liable to sin. The Pharisees want to trap Jesus up. They want to hear Jesus say, I hate Moses and the Mosaic law. So they pose to him a question. They say, Moses prescribed divorce. What do you think about divorce? Jesus responds, because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses allowed a bill of divorce, but in the beginning it was not so. This is the first clue that we have as we look at human creation. The Pharisees are trying to take a very legalistic approach. Jesus is saying, let's stop looking at the way that laws have been written. Let's stop looking at just, this is my experience of human sin and human failure. If we want to see how it is that human beings should exist, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to go back to how things were made to be. And this is something that's very important. It can be very easy for us to look at the world and with a certain amount of cynicism say, goodness is impossible. Truly living up to these standards, that's impossible. It's an unrealistic standard. But the reality is, if we want to understand how it is that we were supposed to be living, we need to go back and see, what was it all about to begin with? We need to sort of scrape off those layers of dirt and get back to that original state of innocence so that we can see at the heart of it all, what does it mean to be human? And this is an important lesson for us all as we try and avoid that cynicism of the Pharisees, avoid the legalism, and say, okay, experience aside, laws aside, what is this all for? What is this all about? We need to get ourselves back to the beginning. And so Jesus takes us back to Genesis 1 and then to Genesis 2. Genesis 1 fundamentally is about objective reality and the order of things, whereas Genesis 2 is more about the subjective reality and relation. Essentially, what we have when we look at Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are, as John Paul II notes, two very distinct stories of creation. Really, what we can say then is that Genesis 1 gives us a more cosmological sense of the world. Genesis shows us how everything relates to everything else. Here's light, here's darkness, here's the sun, here's the moon, here's dry land, here's humans, here's animals. This is how everything, each in its own category, relates to one another. It's a full and total vision of the cosmos. Genesis 2, on the other hand, focuses much more on subjective reality and relationship. It is, in a sense, a much more psychological portrayal of human beings and a much more psychological portrayal of reality. So let's begin by peeling back the layers of Genesis 1 and peeling back the layers of Genesis 2. One of the things that John Paul II notes in Genesis 1, which is also known as the Elohist account. Now, we will sidestep a lot of the debates over editorial history of the Torah, but essentially, the Elohist account is much more conscious of our sin and of our distance from God. And the Elohist account, which is influenced also by the priestly schools of the Old Testament, is going to say we are distant from God. There is an order to things. We must respect this order, but ultimately, we mustn't be too familiar with God. And so we have in Genesis 1 this great emphasis on order. And the poetic structure of Genesis 1 really does emphasize this fact. Here we see, likewise, showing this great vision of a cosmological order of Genesis 1. This is William Blake's great painting of God the Geometer. The Middle Ages in particular were absolutely convinced that God ordered all things with measure, with time, with weight. And if we look at that order, this is really the law that we should abide by. If we're considering what it means to be human and how it is that we can perfect ourselves, especially perfect ourselves in the light of all of the rest of creation, what we have to do is say, how was it all made? And what was it all made for? Remember, in the order of things, Aristotle is going to say the final cause, in a certain sense, precedes all of the three other causes. A house, for instance, the final cause of a house is to be lived in. That desire for a shelter for me to live in, it motivates all of the other causes. It brings together the material cause, the formal cause, and the structural cause. Everything about this, efficient cause, formal cause, everything goes into it because of the final cause, what Aristotle calls the cause of causes. And so if we want to find out what our purpose in life is, we do indeed need to go back to the very beginning and see how it is that God, the great geometer, who we see here with a geometer's compass, how did he make us and what was the order he made us to live by? As we see Genesis 1, one of the first things we notice is the goodness of the created order, that this order of creation is something we should abide by. And this is actually a radical departure in Hebrew literature from a lot of the conventional wisdom around. Plato and his followers, for instance, are always going to hold the material world with a certain amount of distance. Even Aristotle, who is much more at home with the material world than Plato, he is fundamentally going to see matter as a source of decay and corruption. To say that the world is good, to say that the material order is good, is absolutely an innovation of Genesis 1. Without this text, we would not have this conception of the created order being nearly as good as it is. When St. Augustine parts ways with Plato and his followers like Plotinus, it is because of Genesis 1. When Thomas Aquinas says the sacraments and the material elements of the sacraments are good, it's because of Genesis 1. Anytime that we look at the world and the material elements in the world and say, this is good, all of us in the Western civilization can say that it is because of Genesis 1 in a very, very real way. At the end of each single day, God declares it is good. And then evening came and morning followed the first day. Over and over and over again until finally human beings are created, the pinnacle of creation, and then all of a sudden, it's very good. This is the goodness of the created order. And so it shows us that the order in creation, what we see in creation, is indeed something that we should abide by. C.S. Lewis is going to take this tack, for instance, when he says, if we have desires, they are something that can be fulfilled. My desire for theosis, my desire for relationship, my desire for all of these things isn't just some fool's errand, as many people both before and after the great Christian era are going to assert. Everything within us has been given to us for a reason. All of the created order exists for a reason. And ultimately, it is a metaphysical, as John Paul II observes, rather than a physical reason. The created order, the way in which things exist, this is good. And the final cause of our existence, the purpose of our existence, is good. And for humans, we can say then, it is very good. When we are defined by our relationship with God. And this is so important to John Paul II. Remember, John Paul II grew up in the communist regime, and communism in Poland after World War II, it was a very materialistic way of thinking about things. John Paul II absolutely wanted to resist this. He did not want us to be reduced to just another brick in the wall, as Pink Floyd put it, or just another cog in the machine. John Paul II wants to preserve the unique human dignity so that we don't simply get swept up in the vastness of creation. Ultimately, human beings are defined by our relationship with God. Let us make man in our own image and likeness. This, John Paul II is going to note, this is ultimately going to be the only way that we can truly understand what it means to be human. Think back, for instance, to what we were talking about earlier, when we talked about eros and how eros cannot simply be reduced to sexual desire. Sexual desire, it's a very real part of human existence. And it's a very physical part of human existence. And there's a goodness to it. But we cannot simply be reduced to that physical biological urge. Eros, to will the good of another, to love our beloved in a very particular and special way, this is something that is over and beyond simply our material elements. We do have that spiritual part of us, and we can never, ever ignore it. Human beings can never be reduced strictly to that material dimension. As we look at what it means to be married, as we look at what it means to have a family, that relationship and that spiritual dimension to ourselves can never, ever be forgotten. The material element is very much a part of us, but it is not the only part of us. Human beings are unique. We have a foot in both worlds. We are indeed bodies, and that is an essential part of who we are, and we are also spirits, made in the image and likeness of God, with intellect, with free will. And this is an irreducible element to human existence. With the Nazi regime, with the communist regime, John Paul II saw firsthand the problems and the dangers of what happens when we reduce human beings to efficient or inefficient producers, material beings only, dehumanizing, depersonalizing in the full sense of the word. And he absolutely wants to resist that. And so he is going to say, being embodied, it is a good part of us, is an essential part of us, but it is not the only part of us. Genesis 2 is a much more psychological order by contrast. Now, while Genesis 1 was a more Elohist and priestly account of things, Genesis 2 is often referred to as a Yahwist account of things. Now, Elohist comes from the tendency of the author to use the word Elohim, or Lord, in reference to God. Yahwist, when we refer to authors of the Old Testament, the Yahwist strain in the Old Testament authorship comes from the tendency of the authors to use the word Yahweh, the personal name for God. And so the Yahwist authors in general are going to stress much, much more that personal relationship and the nearness of God. So that whereas the Elohists are going to say God is very remote, he acts through angels, there's buffers between us and God, the Yahwist is going to say God is very near us. God is very much like us. And so here we see Michelangelo's great painting, The Creation of Adam in the Sistine Chapel, that moment when God is about to give life to Adam. And it is a moment where God is reaching out. That relationship with God is what gives life to Adam. When we see the order of Genesis 2, the psychological order, God creates human beings first. And this is an inversion of the order and of the pattern in Genesis 1. Genesis 1 finishes with human beings. Genesis 2 begins with the creation of human beings. God creates human beings and then says, here, let me give you some fish, let me give you some animals, let me give you some trees, some plants, and name all of these things. But ultimately what is recognized is no thing, no animal, no rest of the part of the created order is really sufficient to satisfy the human desire for love, the human desire for relationship. And so God says, it is not good for man to be alone. And so then he puts Adam into a sleep and then takes from Adam's rib, he takes a part of Adam and says, I'm going to create Eve. And it is significant that Adam has a part of his rib taken for the creation of Eve. It is not from his foot, so Eve is not someone to be simply trampled underneath. She is not less than Adam. It is not from his head, so that Eve is somehow over, but it is from his rib. It is a part of him very near to his heart, so that Adam and Eve are able to stand next to one another, side by side. And remember what we were talking about with philia. Philia, that friendship of the good that Aristotle was talking about, is when two individuals are able to stand side by side in the world, look out at the world together and say, here it all is. It is not good for man to be alone. Relationship, love is an essential part of who we are. And so then the two become one. And ultimately, it's a model of the Trinity, the beloved and the beloved and the lover, each of them. And they have such a powerful love that the two become one flesh, as Jesus reminds us. And so in this regard, multiple persons in a love so strong that they really are, in a very true sense, one being. This is the Trinity, and it is marriage. And as we see this, we can also see then one of the theological reasons for why it is that marriage in the original order of creation was meant to be something indissoluble. The Trinity cannot separate. God cannot be separated from God. Likewise, once the two become one flesh, what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. And when you think of it in those terms, it makes much more sense. Here is a model of the Trinity. Who am I to separate one part of the Trinity from another, one part of this representation of God from another? Who is any human being? This is the order, this is the goodness that all of us were called to be a model of the Trinity, and two individuals who love each other so much that they say, let's have more of us. The same attitude that the Trinity had toward one another when they said, let's create, let there be light. And ultimately, what Jesus is trying to remind us is, it is this order that redemption is going to take us back to. Genesis 3 and the sins of Genesis 3, this marks the border between our original innocence and our state of fallen humanity. We are so used to our fallen existence, we don't even imagine, we cannot imagine anything else. But this is what the cross is about. This is what the resurrection is about. This is what ultimately the Christian life is about. Not to be content with the cynicism and the failures and the weaknesses of the world, but how can we get back to this original state of innocence? How can we be invited back across the border between sin and innocence? This is what Jesus is inviting the Pharisees back to. And this is the great invitation that the cross and that the resurrection gives us. Remember, one of the consequences of original sin is death. This was made very clear in Genesis 3. What does the cross do? What is the first thing that the cross proclaims, that the resurrection proclaims? Death itself is conquered. And with death, all of the other effects of original sin. Jesus is inviting us, as he invites the Pharisees, destroy the effects of original sin. Do not be content with the evil and the wickedness that you see. Do not simply settle for that lesser standard. Go back to that time of original sin, innocence. Go back over the border. Remember what you were originally called to. This material world, which is indeed a very good world. We should never think, as Plato sometimes did, as Plotinus sometimes did, that the material world is evil. We should never think that, and that only the spiritual is good. Spirit and body, All have been redeemed by God. This is the order that Jesus is calling us back to, an order where relationships are restored, where things are given a newfound permanence, and where we live in the fullness of relationship with one another and a fullness of relationship with God, that relationship and that likeness which truly defines who we are. So these are some of the basic elements of what it means to be human and how it is that the Lord created us. We were created as the pinnacle of creation, as we learn in Genesis 1. And we were created, while we do certainly have a part of us that exists with all the rest of creation. Remember, in Genesis 1, God formed us out of the clay, but then breathed life into us, so that we do have a foot in each world, a foot in the material elements and a foot in the spiritual realm. Both of those things are an essential part of us and an essential part of how it was that we were made. Genesis 2 reminds us that our relationships are essential to human existence, absolutely essential. Our relationships with one another and our relationships with God. And when those relationships dissolve, this is an effect of original sin. Think of Genesis 3. As soon as God says, "Who told you you were naked?" Adam blames Eve. Eve blames the snake. The snake says, "What did you expect?" Relationships are shattered left and right. Our relationships with one another and our relationships with God, shattered. Jesus has come to put an end to that. He has come to bring healing where there was once division, innocence where there was once sin. Never be content with the cynicism of our age. Never be content with weakness. Never be content with limitations. We were made for divinity. We were made to be in the image and likeness of God. Nothing else can fully capture who we are. Nothing else can fully capture what we are. Tomorrow, we're going to discuss in a little more detail then, what is the purpose of marriage, the purpose of the good order of material and spiritual creation, and what does that mean for us? For now, have a good evening. Enjoy that embodied existence. And remember, anything you look around and see in this created order, it is good.